Oh, thank you. Welcome to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. This program today is brought to you by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance. We at the Center know that many of you come to a lot of our programs, and so we're pleased to see familiar faces. So if you've joined us before, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. This program today, we are really pleased as part of a longstanding partnership with Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. Scott Kiefer from Blue Cross is going to take the stage here momentarily, but our team at our center would like to really thank Blue Cross Blue Shield for this partnership on healthcare reform as an ongoing conversation that they've helped us to build over the last couple years. So we're grateful for that support. All of our programs, both the healthcare and the other topics that we bring to you through CSPG, are supported by both foundations, corporations, and individuals in the community. On the back of your program, you'll see a list of folks, some of our major sponsors of our programming at our center, as well as we have a number of individual and family donors. If you are interested in joining us as part of our donor circle, I'd invite you to get in touch. My contact information is here, and happy to start or continue a conversation. And with that, I'd like to welcome Scott Kiefer.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Larry. I'm really excited about today's program, and obviously I'm very excited to welcome Bill Galston, but I really appreciate that Vice President Mondale has joined us, and it's a thrill for me to be here with the Vice President. Thank you very much. I think it goes without saying that we live in a pretty dark period in our history, and I hope that we'll shine some light on that today. The outpouring that we've seen over the last week, two very concerning events. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I lived in Squirrel Hill throughout law school, so it hits pretty close to home for me personally. Is tragic beyond belief, but I hope that just as Vice President Mondale and the legacy of Humphrey shines as a beacon in Minnesota's leadership in our national politics and some of the divisions, I hope that we see that today with the discussion. And when we think about Bill Galston, I think about somebody who really has focused on the opportunities that unite us more than the ideologies that have become hyper-driven that divide us. So in as much as I'm eager for the election results, I want to get those past us and focus on November the 7th and what we need to do as a state and a nation. I'm also really excited because I started in Capitol Hill in 1993 and watched Bill from afar and been a big admirer of his, and have eagerly awaited his columns in the Wall Street Journal. And I know that Bill will present, or at least discuss today, what he and I were just discussing, which is some very interesting polling results in today's Wall Street Journal, comparing white women with a college education to white men without a college education, and how the divergence is there politically. But as we think about focusing on what unites us as opposed to what divides us, I think there's such an opportunity in looking at a myriad of issues, not just healthcare, but another thing that Bill's been involved in that we've talked extensively about is what we're going to do to sort of reorient the misalignment that we currently have in the workforce and the skills gap. So for those who pay attention to economic data and information, you know that for the first time in the most recent jobs report, we actually have more job openings than there are job seekers. That's a frustrating thing in thinking about, again, those political gaps and those political divisions, because in as much as we had well-intended policies in the 1990s and 2000s, there is a misalignment in terms of skills training when we look at plumbers, pipe fitters, electricians. And I know that, again, there's a lot of focus on those divisions, but I think that Kurt Doubt and Tom Bach, and I suspect Jeff Johnson and Tim Walls agree on the need to align those skills, and Bill has spent a lot of time thinking about that and working on it. I would point as well to one other positive sign that was really important this fall. So we had two old bulls in the United States Senate, Richard Shelby and Patrick Leahy, who Vice President knows very well. They came together and they agreed that we were going to have some rationality to the budget process, known as the annual appropriations season. And they passed a number of bills, I think all but one bill, in time that there didn't have to be a temporary spending measure. And that probably went unnoticed in the country, but there was a point where we were having open questions in August and September about whether we would have a government shutdown, and what that would have done in this hyperbolic election year would have been very concerning. So that may be a small, but it's a tangible sign of, I think, some people in the Congress hopefully working together, taking charge of the agenda. So with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Bill Galston to the podium. Thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing some rationality to the politics. And thank you again, Mr. Vice President, for your service and the opportunity to have a small part in this session with you today. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Thanks to Scott for his warm welcome and introduction. I remember once that Vice President Mondale began a speech after he'd received an effusive introduction by saying, "Thank you, thank you. My father would have enjoyed those remarks, and my mother would have believed them." I am particularly grateful to Vice President Mondale for giving me an opportunity to go on his great presidential journey with him exactly half my life ago, 36 years ago. It was the most instructive experience of my life, and I've been learning from it ever since. I have just a few minutes before we get to the heart of this, which is a conversation, which is what I enjoy the most, and I suspect you too. So I'm just going to offer some very brief introductory remarks, and I don't intend to shock or surprise you in any way, but simply to put out some basics that I think we're all familiar with. And for convenience, I'll just number the points that I'm going to make, starting with number one, and that is, we are a divided country. We're divided geographically between the big cities and every place else. We're divided demographically, racially, and ethnically. And we're divided by gender and education. On the front page of the Wall Street Journal, Scott mentioned, was a remarkable analysis of the past 25 years of American politics. Just 20 years ago, in the midterm election of 1998, white men without college degrees were slightly more likely to favor Democratic control of Congress than were white women with college degrees. That was 20 years ago. According to the most recent Wall Street Journal poll, this year, by a margin of 75 percentage points, white women with college degrees are more likely to favor Democratic control of Congress than white men without college degrees. And this great revolt of the working class is not peculiar to the United States. It is happening throughout the industrialized world, and it has helped to fuel the populist explosion that we've seen in the United States, the United Kingdom, and from Europe, from the Atlantic almost to the Urals. There are also partisan divisions. Brookings and an outfit called the Public Religion Research Institute team up every year to produce something called the American Values Survey. We just released the latest edition a couple of days ago, And we asked a series of questions, all of which revealed a profound partisan divide. But let me give you just one nugget from the survey. We asked people, compared to the 1950s, do you think America's culture and way of life have gotten better or gotten worse? 60% of Democrats said it's gotten better. 64% of Republicans say it's gotten worse. That's sort of a bottom line question, isn't it? That's a bottom line judgment on the past half century of American history. And the partisans of the different parties have diametrically opposed judgments, verdicts, if you will, on the last half century. So that's point number one. Point number two, which I will state very quickly, but it'll help tee up some of our policy discussion. There's a deep, pervasive mistrust of government, especially at the federal level. 50 years ago, the federal government was the most trusted layer of our federal system. Today, it's the least trusted layer of our federal system. Now, the closer government is to the people, the more trusted it is, the more distant, the less trusted. Third, not only are we divided, but the influence of the right pole of public opinion and the left pole of public opinion has become magnified in our politics. So you can say now that the poles are P-O-L-E-S, not L-L-S. The poles are really driving the public discussion. I'll give you a couple of examples. The immigration, 5 years ago, we got pretty close to passing comprehensive immigration reform. Today, what's the debate? On the right pole, we hear arrest and deport. On the left pole, we hear abolish ICE. Where's the middle? Or look at the way the healthcare discussion has become polarized, literally. One party says repeal Obamacare. The loudest voices in the other party now say Medicare for all. Point four, there's still hope. Why is that? Because on issue after issue, there is a majority coalition stretching from the center right to the center left that actually agrees on a path forward. Our problem is not that we don't have majorities in favor of a reasonable, honorable compromise. The problem is that our party system and our political institutions do not allow that latent majority to express itself. And I'll give you an historical example, one I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. In 2013, comprehensive immigration reform passed the Senate of the United States with all 54 Democrats in favor and 14 Republicans, 68 votes, enough to override a presidential veto, although with Barack Obama in the White House, I can assure you there would not have been one. Everybody knew that if exactly that same bill had been allowed to come to the floor of the House of Representatives for a vote, it would have passed. The Speaker wouldn't allow it to come to a vote. Why? Because the coalition that would have passed it would have been the majority of the minority party, that is to say the Democrats, and a minority of the majority party, that is to say the Republicans. But the Speaker took the position that unless the majority of the majority was in favor of a bill, it wouldn't ever get to the floor. There are institutional reforms that a bipartisan caucus that I've been working with is sponsoring that would make it a lot easier for those latent House majorities to become actual House majorities. A very simple package of rules reforms would greatly increase the likelihood that the operation of our political institutions and parties would not frustrate the will of the majority of the American people. Finally, what are the implications of all of this for health care? Just a couple of remarks or reminders, really, about the Affordable Care Act. Recall that it had two objectives. Objective number one was to broaden coverage and to dramatically decrease the percentage of the American people who had to walk around without any kind of health insurance. Objective number 2, as it was famously expressed by Peter Orszag, the President Obama's major economic advisor on health care, objective number 2 was to, quote, bend the cost curve. Remember that? Well, the Affordable Care Act succeeded in expanding coverage as a share of the total population quite dramatically, and it would have been even more successful if the bill as originally drafted had not been invalidated in part by the Supreme Court. But I think we can now make the judgment that as a legislative vehicle for bending the cost curve, it did not succeed. After a brief pause in healthcare costs, which in retrospect can be attributed to the Great Recession and the fact that a lot of people were even less able to pay for health care than they were before, and so didn't go to the doctor, and the pressure on healthcare costs was temporarily diminished. Healthcare costs have re-accelerated in the past few years. A report that J.P. Morgan Chase put out earlier this month found that between 2014 and 2015, out-of-pocket costs increased by 3.5% for the average household. Between 2015 and 2016, by 5.5%. From 2016 to 2017, by 8.5%. See a pattern? I can assure you that wages didn't go up by 8.5% last year, and household income certainly didn't. So inevitably, out-of-pocket costs as a share of household income also went up. So we are nowhere near dealing with the cost pressures in the healthcare system. I have some ideas for how to do that, and I could sum up half of my thinking in the following terms. Use markets where markets can help curb cost increases, and use regulation where they can't. That sounds pretty straightforward, but let me give you an example of where markets can't. Okay? You're in a bad accident on the highway. You're not going to go shopping for the cheapest emergency care, I can assure you that, right? And whatever drops in from the sky or speeds up from the back is going to be what you use, and there is going to be no way of restraining emergency care costs unless through government regulation of some sort or another. There are other areas where markets would be effective, like elective surgery, but right now, in major metropolitan areas, if you're interested in a hip replacement, there's a gap of 3 to 1 between the most expensive and the least expensive hip replacement. And nobody knows that. So I think that if you're going to have a market in elective medical procedures, that you ought to have full price transparency available to every consumer at every hospital, so that he or she can walk in the door and ask to see the list of comparative prices for the same operation at every healthcare institution in that metropolitan area. That doesn't sound too complicated. How many people go shopping for MRIs? In many metropolitan areas, there's a gap of 5 to 1 between the most expensive MRI price and the least expensive MRI price. That doesn't sound like much of a market to me. It sounds like an information-free non-market rather than an information-rich market. I could go on, but it seems to me that it is time for the conversation to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill Galston. Vice President Mondale, do you want to start out with a few words?
I'm very glad that Bill could be here. Bill and I have had a long relationship when I was senator or vice president. He worked with us, and as he mentioned, he was in that campaign and engineered our victory. We only lost by how many percent? It was called the Gulstan Effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The number, for those who are interested, is 18%.
Yeah, so we were almost there.
If we just had another couple of days to campaign in Minnesota,
I know
who
it.
knows?
I would have lost Minnesota, yeah. We're getting off to a slow start here, I think. Bill operates out of the,
Brookings.
where are you now?
The Brookings Institution.
Brookings Institution, which is one of the most unique nonprofit research centers in the country. It's got enormous stature in our nation's capital, and it has a record of digging into the real issues that bear on our federal government, and it brings people the quality of Bill Gulstan there to help dig into those things. So at least we know, if we want to, that there's places we can go and get an honest answer. We face, well, how many days before the election?
6.
Yeah, come on, let's get it over with. I'm a political hack, so I'm always reading all these dope stories about who's going to win. And I think you write some of them, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who's going to win? Why don't we start with that?
Yeah. So here's the real dope from Washington. That's me. So you can apply whatever discount you want, but I am quite confident that if the election were held today, there would be a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. I have believed for about 3 months that the most likely gain would be in the neighborhood of 30 or 32 seats,
Yeah.
which is about what the Democrats gained in 2006 when they retook the majority in the House after a number of years wandering in the minority desert. It would require something close to a miracle for Democrats to achieve the same result in the Senate. But that has a lot to do with, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, the electoral map. There are 35 Senate seats up this year. 26 of them are held by Democrats, only 9 by Republicans. And of those 26 Democratic seats, 10 are in states that Donald Trump carried. And so that is making life very difficult for Mr. Tester in Montana. The president is going out for his 4th rally in Montana in just a couple of days. You know, he's made life difficult for Mr. Donnelly in Indiana, for Claire McCaskill in Missouri. The list goes on. Interestingly, in the state that he carried by more than 40 points, namely West Virginia, the most pro-Trump state in the country, a very savvy politician, former governor, now Senator Joe Manchin, appears to have the pulse of his state well enough to survive, and he has been forced to tack, to the Republican side on a couple of key votes in order to insulate himself against the Trump effect. So you put it all together, and I don't think it would be surprising to see Republican actual Republican gains in the Senate of a seat or two. Tennessee is a really tough state, even for a former governor like Phil Bredesen, the Democrat, and a very, very good candidate. But I don't think it will necessarily be enough to overcome, the red tide that's flowing in Tennessee. So that's my short answer to your question. It's a mixed bag. But I don't need to tell you or anybody in the room that even having a share of power in Congress will give the Democratic Party opportunities for both legislation and oversight that it does not enjoy right now.
The one thing about not controlling the Senate, and I agree with you, I don't think we'll get the Senate back, is that treaties and nominations go through the Senate and not the House. So if you've got a controversial nominee for judge or for a cabinet officer, it's very hard to beat them when it's a majority vote. I've never lived in that environment because it was always 60%, or most of my career was 2/3 of the Senate required to end debate. So that's a big change in American life. Not only, well, you saw it in the Kavanaugh nomination. There was no sweetness. There was no diplomacy. There was no negotiations to try to come up with a agreed answer. It was just organizing the majority and jamming it through. Mm-hmm. And that's a big change in American life. We see it in what kind of judges we're getting. We're seeing it in the kind of anger and divisiveness of American politics. And I don't know how you shape an issue to get returned to some sort of Rule 22 balance to make certain that the harshness of this new system disappears, that we have some debate and balance, and then it would require, say, 55 seats or something to get confirmation. I think you'd see a very dramatic change in the temperament of the Senate. And I worry about it because we're going to see more and more of this, I think. You see, this is not today's discussion, but the Senate Majority Leader is about as harsh and intemperate toward the need for balance and civility in the Senate. You know, when I was there, the leader was Mike Mansfield. Mm-hmm. Mike Mansfield was about as decent and kind to both sides as a leader could be. Hugh Scott was the leader in the Senate side. Really, if he were here, everybody'd like him, nice guy. That's all gone now, and a lot of it's got to do with the rules.
Yeah, I agree, but just to maintain the note of bipartisanship or nonpartisanship that is so appropriate but not always present in university discussions. I should say that the place that the Senate has arrived is like Murder on the Orient Express. Mm-hmm. A lot of people wielded the knife, yeah. And I think it's I think it's fair to say, in point of character and partisanship, there's not a big difference between Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid. And as a matter of fact, Harry Reid got so frustrated with his inability to push President Obama's judicial nominees through that for every level except the Supreme Court, he forced through the elimination of the filibuster.
He did. That's true.
And I actually have in my files, the speech that the then minority leader gave, right before that was done, in which he warned Senator Reid not to take this step because if he did, he would live to regret it, quote unquote. And so I think that it is a dance of mutual frustration that has brought us to the point where the majority simply wants to get its way without regard to the minority.
If I could just cite one example to the contrary, if you read the statements I made at the time, I always said, be careful of just make majority rule. Have a little balance here. 2/3 was too much. Nobody knows where that balance should be.
Yeah.
But majority rule has no balance to it. 2/3 doesn't. So at least there were a few people out there warning of this.
Oh, I was talking about the leaders, the official leaders as opposed to the moral leaders who are always in the right place.
Write that down, will you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't forget it, is what you're saying.
Well, this has been a terrific start. I wanted to give a shout out to Bill Galston's new book, which is entitled Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. It's a very readable, interesting, provocative book.
You forgot to say short.
It's very short. Chapters, I don't think there's one chapter more than 25 pages.
Max.
And I hear it's an excellent holiday gift. Is that true?
It fits neatly into most stockings and all pantyhose.
And one of the things that's very interesting about this book is that Bill Galston has a sympathetic explanation for the populist swings that we've seen in Europe and now we've seen in America. And rather than dismissing it as kind of a freakish thing without explanation, he offers a very thorough explanation as to why we've seen Donald Trump so successfully tap into this populist streak. And one of the aspects of this populist swing that I wanted to focus our conversation on, because I do think there's a big tie-in here on healthcare, is what you referred to as a cultural shift. And I'm just going to read or summarize a section where you're talking about higher education now helping to create a fundamental divide in American society between those who are highly educated and those who are not. And you say at one point in this discussion that educational inequalities have now become markers of social status. Put bluntly, if Americans with more education regard their less educated fellow citizens with disrespect, the inevitable response from the disrespected will be resentment coupled with a desire to take revenge on those who assert superiority. Much of the populist spirit in the United States reflects this dynamic. That's a very, I mean, that, to be honest, that's putting the spotlight on my class of people, the academic types, the commentators, the folks who are maybe, referring to working class voters and those who are less well educated as deplorable. Mm-hmm. This is a pretty stinging comment.
Well, one political analyst whose name escapes me right now remarked recently that he thought that the deplorables comment might have cost Hillary Clinton 500,000 votes. And that does not sound like a wild overestimate to me. I think there's a problem. And the problem began with a very honorable impulse to break down the old class system and to award upward mobility based on merit, on individual accomplishment. And if you compare, for example, Ivy League schools in the 1950s to what they are now, in the 1950s, and I know this because my father arrived at Yale University in 1955 as a very young professor, the majority of the slots in the freshman class went to young men from prep schools. That's the way the system worked back then. And then there was a revolution, and the idea was it was how well you did in high school and your test scores that would determine whether you got into the elite institutions. And it was natural to say, well, if I do very well in high school, get high grades, keep my nose to the grindstone, get 1550 total score on the SATs, well, I've earned this. I deserve it, right? I have excelled. And you can't say you've excelled unless you have done better than someone else. And so educational excellence became a badge of individual merit or individual worth in the eyes of, or in the self-regard of what I'm calling the new meritocracy. And then, as my colleague Richard Reeves has pointed out in a recent book, The Dream Hoarders, members of this new meritocracy have figured out how to replicate their success and to pass it on to their children. And that's what helicopter parenting is all about.
So let me just bring this back to healthcare,
Yeah.
because it strikes me that in an area like healthcare, where there's such an emotional and very personal bond. I mean, our healthcare is about do we live or not, and our health,
Right.
and the health of those we love. It's about as personal and as one can imagine. And yet, the issues that we discuss, whether it's the individual mandate, which Bill Galston could summarize in probably a paragraph, but you'd have to pay attention. And these kind of issues that require some level of expertise have now been kind of swept up into this understandable pattern of kind of populist revolt against expertise. So how is it that we can talk sensibly about a complicated topic like health reform without triggering the very kind of populist revolt that I think you quite rightly have characterized?
Well, one promising path, I think, is to begin with what people agree on and then see if we can build out from that. Let me give you a very topical example. I just saw a survey to the effect that 75% of Americans believe that the protections against exclusion from insurance based on pre-existing conditions built into the Affordable Care Act ought to be preserved. And it's why the Republican Party, which spent nearly 8 years inveighing against the Affordable Care Act in all of its works and ways, is now running ads throughout the country saying, we too are in favor of protection against exclusion based on pre-existing conditions. Okay, that's a pretty solid foundation to build on because you cannot protect people with pre-existing conditions unless they are in the same plan as people who do not have these afflictions. How can that be? Well, the individual mandate, making sure, to put it as simply as possible, that we're all in the same boat, the lucky and the unlucky, can row together, and that when the lucky, healthy person's bad luck turn comes, that there'll be somebody else in the boat to row if that person can't do it anymore. In other words, there are ways of starting with agreement and then explaining why things that people are uncomfortable with are necessary.
So just to come back to, I think, one of your central points, which is about this gap between the policy majority in America and the veto points or the blockages in Congress for translating that. Pre-existing conditions, you're right, supermajorities favors it, and yet we've got the Trump administration, part of a legal action to try to topple the pre-existing condition clause and sections in the Affordable Care Act. We also saw in the House of Representatives a vote for a piece of legislation which weakened the pre-existing condition by beginning to undermine what's known as community rating and rolling back what are known as essential health benefits. Are you following this? Right? I mean, we're already kind of down the road in which we're into a conversation that it's a bit esoteric.
It's a bit esoteric, but I think Every successful politician understands that his or her first duty is clear communication with the people, with the electorate, and even people who aren't part of the electorate, right, to fellow citizens. And our most effective presidents have figured out how to take complex issues and to express them in ordinary English, right? FDR's first fireside chat began with the following words: "Tonight, I would like to talk to you about banking." Okay, now that is not the most promising beginning for a fireside chat, but people listen. Go back and read that fireside chat. Banking is pretty darn complicated. But it sure didn't sound that complicated when he explained it. And effective political leaders work as hard on the language of public communication as they do on the details of public policy.
Let me touch on that a minute.
Mr. Mondale.
Some people out here, maybe a few that were around when I was in politics, and I think you knew or remember that we worked very hard, killed ourselves, to get out into rural areas, get on the wrong side of town, to break down barriers between the advantage, the disadvantage, so that people who were out in Rock County could see us and talk to us and felt that they were a part of the deal. The last several years, I don't see that happening. Now, Amy does it. She gets around. But you look at the rhetoric, if you're just a farmer or you're a worker with unskilled or even with skills, and you live out in those areas, I think it would be pretty easy to think that you weren't part of the serious discussions about what government should do. Part of it is because we've been in the middle of these social issues the last 10, 15 years, and I think we needed to do. I'll tell him to call later.
While Mr. Mondale's resting his phone, I want to welcome questions. There are question cards and folks collecting them. I want to get to as many as we can.
I think that our politics not only looked like we were preoccupied with social issues, and some of that was necessary, but it was also, they didn't see us out in Laverne anymore. They didn't see us getting around. It looked like a city operation. Mm-hmm. And I think that was true all over the country. I don't want to pick on every state, but I think we lost a lot of altitude there with working class people, with farmers and so on, that we used to have, because we had a kind of a different strategy where we didn't get out there the way we used to. There's this, you probably know, there's this technocratic idea about politics. You don't have to spend time with people. You can get a calculator there that'll tell you how they're going to vote. You can imagine how popular that is. Mm. That's deadly stuff.
Yeah, well, I have some good news, and that is that I think the Democratic Party, which was guilty as charged, had a huge shock, got a huge shock in 2016, which has led to some really important changes. And let me just give you two examples. There is now something called the Heartland Caucus in the House of Representatives, led by a very talented and energetic member of Congress from Illinois by the name of Sherry Bustos, who actually put out a major report and based on an enormous amount of just going out and talking to folks. It wasn't an anonymous survey. There were dozens and dozens of town halls and interviews all across the non-coastal part of the country. Secondly, after an extended period in which Democrats were simply not contesting House seats in small towns and rural areas, this year a record low number of Republican incumbents in small towns and rural areas are running uncontested. That number is now 10. A friend of mine just ran the numbers on this last week, the lowest number ever recorded. And so Democrats have begun to take on board the wisdom of a very experienced political analyst, namely Woody Allen, who said famously that 80% of life is just showing up. Well, that's probably 80% of politics, too. And Democrats who got such a terrible shock in 2016 are now beginning to show up again. And I think that was an inflection point. And, and people are really getting out of their geographical comfort zones. And
That's
if you look
good.
at the way this young man, Beto O'Rourke, is campaigning in Texas, right? He's been to all 254 counties in Texas. I spent 10 years in Texas, and let me tell you, you really have to be dedicated to go to, and especially because in some of those counties, when your campaign team shows up to campaign, you double the population of that county, right? But still, he's done it because he wanted to send the signal that he respects all the voters of Texas, wherever they may live. Very important.
Bill Galston, you were making the point that if we're going to escape this cycle of populist backlash against expert reasoning, the technocratic situation we have in America, that it's important to communicate, and good politicians do that. So let me give you an example from the other side of the aisle, which is the very compelling arguments that Democrats have been making on behalf of single payer. Now, we've done a program on single payer, and one of the interesting parts of that is it seems to be one of those issues in almost a fact-free zone. You have Vermont, progressive state with a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature that passed single payer in the year of 2011. There was a wholehearted effort to figure out how to implement it.
Yep.
It was not possible. And the Democratic governor came back and said, we cannot do this. Similar thing happened in California.
Right.
So here we have a growing number of Democrats in the House, in the Senate in Washington, and Democratic presidential candidates who are saying they support Medicare for all or some form of single payer, and yet where's the evidence for it? So how do you, isn't this the case where clear communication has led us, kind of into this rabbit hole where we can't just speak about facts and about expert analysis?
Well, the question is, what are you clearly communicating? Are you clearly communicating a policy that makes sense, and you're expressing the common sense or good sense of that policy to people who don't want to wade through single-spaced pages of details? Or are you engaging in a kind of a false clarity that is not just fact-free, but fact-avoiding? And so a survey that I saw just a couple of weeks ago showed that when people are exposed to the simple arguments in favor of a single-payer program, 60% are in favor. When they're exposed to the most obvious arguments against it, about 20% of that 60% peels away, and you're left with 60-40 against. To bring this to contemporary politics, I'm almost embarrassed to say this with the former Vice President of the United States, sitting on the podium along with me, but in the United States, as opposed to a parliamentary system, the way that a great party defines itself is through the contest for its presidential nomination. And I think we're going to have a debate, a debate in 2019 and 2020 that will in part be a debate about the way forward on health care. And The fundamental choices can be stated very simply. Are we going to build on the foundation established by the Affordable Care Act, or are we going to try to replace the Affordable Care Act with something structurally different? And candidates are not all going to take the same position on that question. For example, the first name of Minnesota's senior senator was mentioned by the vice president a couple of minutes ago. To the best of my knowledge, she hasn't hopped on the Medicare for All train. She has called for incremental improvements on the platform established by the Affordable Care Act. That is a choice that Democrats are going to have to make. My fear is that if they make the wrong choice, then the obvious counter-arguments against Medicare for All are going to be wielded to very great effect by the Republican nominee, who is almost certain to be Donald J. Trump.
Yep.
You mentioned, and there's several questions in here, but you had mentioned that there were institutional reforms that you think would facilitate the translation of what most Americans prefer in terms of policy into actual congressional legislation, at least help to ease that much more than it is today. What are one or two of those reforms that make sense?
Well, here's a piece of good news. I've spent portions of my free time, over the past few years working with a bipartisan caucus in the House of Representatives called the Problem Solvers. And a think tank I'm associated with, not Brookings, did some spade work for them and came up with a menu of possible reforms to the rules of the House of Representatives. And they spent 3 months in bipartisan deliberation over the rules reform idea and came out with a pretty robust package of their own. So here's one example of how the system could be made more friendly. There is a procedure in the House of Representatives called the discharge petition. What that means very simply is that if you can get 218 members to sign the petition, then that bill is discharged from the committee where it's stuck, and it can go to the floor of the House of Representatives for consideration. In the old days, the discharge petition was anonymous. And then, I forget when, probably about 10 years ago, it was changed so that your signature became public the moment you affixed it to the discharge petition. As you can imagine, that enabled the leaders of your party, if you were breaking with party ranks, in order to sign that petition, to come down on you like a ton of bricks and force you off the petition, or if you'd made approving noises about the petition, to warn you away from it before you ever signed. And that is exactly what happened with some reform legislation in the most recent Congress. They got up to about 20 Republicans broke ranks and joined with the Democrats. They needed 3 more Republican signatures, and the leadership of the Republican leadership went to all the people who'd indicated they were about to sign and told them what was going to happen to them if they did. And that was the end of the discharge petition. So one proposal is to make it anonymous, again, private rather than public. Another proposal is to make it very, very difficult for the House Rules Committee to prevent the consideration of amendments to bills that have broad bipartisan support. So one version of this is that, well, here's a little bit of House of Representatives Rules 101. The most powerful committee in the House of Representatives is the Rules Committee, which is completely controlled by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And it dictates not only which bills will come to the floor, but the terms under which they'll come to the floor. And more, the Rules Committee is approving what's known as a closed rule, which means that the bill comes to the floor as is for an up or down vote because no amendments are allowed. So one of the proposals is that if there's an amendment to a bill that is supported by 20 members of the majority and 20 members of the minority, that amendment would go straight to the floor for consideration as part of the bill. That the Rules Committee would not be able to say no to possible amendments that enjoy a substantial measure of bipartisan support. I could go on. There are about 20 items in this list, but if even half of them were accepted, they would, I think, make a perceptible difference in the comity and bipartisanship within the House of Representatives.
Just one thing.
Could you bring your mic closer?
Yeah, I've watched the House for about 50 years.
Yeah.
They never get anything right.
This is said by
Republicans
former
or
Senator
Democrats,
Mondale.
so don't work too hard on it. Go over to the Senate and see if you can change them.
Senators are harder to budge, I've
Yeah,
noticed.
but if you get them, you got something.
Well, that's absolutely true. This reminds me of a number of old stories, but in the interest of time, I'll spare you all of them.
This is a very famous rivalry. It's like Army and Navy. This is the House and the Senate.
Yeah.
And so we have a former senator here.
No,
Bill
but
Gulstan
here's the story. Here's the story. I'll tell it briefly. It was the freshman congressman
This is a
who,
famous
in the
story.
hearing of his party's leader, refers to the other party as the enemy, and the leader put its arms around him and says, "Son, you have it all wrong. They're the opposition. The Senate is the enemy."
Bill Galston, we've got a number of questions here
Yeah,
from
yeah.
the audience. Maybe we can roll through some of them.
Yeah,
I've been
sure.
including them in many of the questions I've been asking. Here's one, though. You speak of polarization, seem to imply that there's extremism on both sides. You referred to the polls driving policy. But isn't the real question what happened to the Republican Party, as your colleague at the Brookings, Tom Mann, has argued?
Well, suffice it to say that Tom and I have had many spirited discussions about his theory of what he calls asymmetrical polarization. And my argument is that in the broad sweep of history, the Democratic Party changed, and then the Republican Party changed. And so if you look at the Democratic Party in the mid-1960s and the Republican Party in the mid-1960s, and then compare them to their current incarnations, today's Democrats are about as far from the Democratic Party of 53 years ago as today's Republicans are from the Republican Party of 53 years ago. The Republicans have changed more recently. But Vice President Mondale was talking about the extraordinary focus on the social issues among Democrats in the past generation. That is part of a great transformation in the party, where the Democratic Party gradually lost touch with its working class base. So Tom Mann and I tell the story differently. And as with many stories in politics, it depends on when you begin the story.
But just to get back to the question,
Yeah.
isn't the issue you're talking about fundamentally about what happened with the Republican Party in terms of them becoming far more conservative than the Democratic Party becoming liberal, or do you just disagree with that idea?
I just disagree. I disagree. On cultural issues, I think the Democrats have shifted as much to the left as Republicans have to the right.
On economic issues,
That's a different
tax
story.
and spending.
That's a different story. But unfortunately, the focus on cultural issues in the past generation has exacerbated this movement in both directions. There was a time in living memory when the Republican Party was more pro-choice than the Democratic Party, and Vice President Mondale will remember that. And in the early years after the Roe v. Wade decision, both parties were betwixt and between on the issue. It wasn't really until the Reagan era that a fuller sorting out occurred. There was a time in living memory when, when Southern Baptists were pro-choice, because being pro-life meant to be in the same boat with the Catholics, and they wouldn't have that. So,
Bill Galston, you have not talked about people of color in many of your comments.
that's true.
One of the questions here, do the same dramatic gaps exist in working class opinion among people of color as they do among white voters?
And the answer is no. And in the case of the African American community, I think it's largely because of a widespread and fact-based feeling that regardless of class and education, they are in the same boat. And so these class and educational differences, although they're not insignificant, and anybody who's lived in Washington for 36 years, as I have, will have observed that there are differences and fissures within the African American community based on level of education, income, where they live, and even African Americans will admit privately, skin color.
Nonetheless,
Yeah.
about 90% of African Americans vote.
I began by saying, despite these differences, they have a powerful and well-justified sense that at the end of the day, they are all in the same boat. But I am not sure that college-educated white women and working-class white men really do believe that they're in the same boat anymore. That's the force of this Wall Street Journal poll that I talked about at the beginning in my opening comments.
Bill Galston, there's now a conversation about nationalism.
Yeah.
In a way that we have not heard in America in decades. There was a period after World War II where nationalism was feared because of what had happened during the 20th century and the horrors and the instability and the wars that resulted. We've now seen nationalism rehabilitated, clearly with Donald Trump, but it's also fair to say there are others who are talking about it. Larry Summers, the former Obama administration Treasury Secretary, talked about responsible nationalism. You've talked about decent, responsible nationalism, which is, I guess, a friendly amendment. And we've heard people like Theda Skocpol, who's a progressive academic, talk about big government nationalism. What is the place of nationalism in America for those who are concerned about the constitutional order?
Well, nationalism and the constitutional order are hardly incompatible. As a matter of fact, our constitutional order is at the heart of our nation, and it should be at the heart of our national pride as a nation. But let me put the issue much more simply. There is nothing wrong, just to begin at the beginning, we are not obliged to be absolutely neutral as between our children and other children. We're obliged to care for all children, but we're not obliged to have the same sentiment towards all children as we do to our own. That would be, literally speaking, unnatural. And similarly, there's nothing wrong with feeling a distinctive pride in and connection to one's own country. That is not incompatible with international cooperation. We are not we are not required to be citizens of the world. I'm not even sure that phrase has a distinctive meaning, but we are not required to say, I am neutral between the well-being of my own country and the well-being of other countries. And if you are seen as saying or even implying, well, I am neutral, I don't care specially for my own country, if you give off those vibes as a political leader, you're going to be vulnerable. The problem with Europe was nationalism based on race and ethnicity. But taking pride in one's own country, that doesn't have to lead to war. So we have to make some distinction here in order to see what's dangerous and what isn't.
I think it's fair to say that there's quite a bit of concern in America, and I think particularly just in the last week or so, but this has been going on for a while, that the very foundation and stability of American democracy is somehow under threat. We hear it among our students, we hear it among colleagues, and I hear it a lot in Minnesota and elsewhere. Bill Galston, do you see American democracy as kind of teetering, as really facing or maybe undergoing a genuine decomposition?
This is one of the great debates in not only the policy circles that I travel in, but also the academic circles. And I've had public debates with a young man by the name of Yasha Monk, whom some of you may have heard of, because he published a much bigger book on this topic 2 weeks before mine, and we've become sort of Madeline Murray O'Hare and the Preacher, a debating tag team across the country ever since. I haven't yet disappeared the way she did. I am on the optimistic side of this debate. That is to say, I see our constitutional institutions as being tested, but in the main, passing the test. The press, although criticized on an hourly basis, remains free and independent. Unlike what's happened in countries like Hungary and Poland, our civil society remains free and independent. Our courts have not been taken over by the government or by the executive branch the way they have in a number of other countries. I know some people disagree with that, but in fact, there are limits as to what any one president can do to reshape the federal judiciary, and both parties have had their chance over the past 2 generations. And somehow our constitutional order survived decades of liberal dominance of the judiciary, and I suspect that it will survive decades of conservative dominance of the judiciary, even though many of us in this room will not be particularly pleased with decisions made by the conservative judiciary. And even though rule of law is not a phrase that comes trippingly to the lips to describe the current president of the United States, I note for the record that when the courts told him that he could not proceed with his initial travel ban, he chose not to defy the court, but to try a second draft, and when that didn't do any better, he went to a third draft, which finally did survive constitutional muster. And we would have a real constitutional crisis if the Supreme Court of the United States makes a decision that the President of the United States chooses to defy. But not even Richard Nixon did that, even though his decision not to defy the Supreme Court cost him his presidency. As for American society, I am old enough to remember 1968, and I honestly believe that 1968 was worse than what we have now. It was worse in a different way, but I think it was worse. So yes, I am confident about the United States. I'm confident about the established democracies as a whole. Although we think of the period between World War I and World War II as a period in which democracies were falling like 10 pins, in fact, not a single well-established democracy collapsed from the inside during that period. The democracies that fell were the ones that had been established after the First World War and did not enjoy widespread popular support. And similarly, I'll end this long question with this sentence, I think in current circumstances, I am not worried about self-government in Germany or France. I'm worried about it in Hungary and Poland, but they started a lot later and from a much lower base of democratic sentiment and experience.
Mr. Mondale, what's your view about where our democracy is? Could you bring?
I agree.
Could you bring?
Basically agree with that answer. I don't think that there's reason to be morose and bereft. I think our democracy is working quite well. Our constitutional system is in place. We have a population in which these values are deeply imbued. Over 200 years of American history. I know we're facing some problems. I think, but there are a lot of remedies in the hands of the American people. One next Tuesday, we could see if they decide to take the House away from the president. That'd be a big step. So I'm not pessimistic about it. I don't like it, but I'm not pessimistic.
I want to close with a couple of thank yous. First, a big shout out to Scott Kiefer, Blue Cross Blue Shield. This has been an incredible partnership. Thank you very much. Also want to give a shout out for a couple extraordinary programs excuse me, that we have coming up. Elections next Tuesday. The next day, Wednesday, 9 a.m., we're going to have an incredible discussion. Representative Ilhan Omar will be here. Former Congressman Vin Weber will be here. Denise Cardinal and Ben Golnick are the kind of opposing sides of efforts to take control of the Minnesota State House. Will be here. It's going to be an incredible discussion. If you're wondering what happened on Tuesday night, this is the spot to come to. And then November 14th, we have an incredible program. It's with David Cole, who is he's head of the legal department of the ACLU. Before that, Vice President Mondale and I know him as a scholar and as a really terrific analyst of our Constitution. He has a following, his writings have a following among liberals and conservatives because he's fundamentally arguing about individual rights and liberties. And he's done that across Democratic and Republican administrations. Very smart guy. He'll be here November 14th. I want to thank this incredible panel. Bill Galston, thank you for coming out from Washington, D.C. I also want to thank Vice President Walter Mondale. We are now teaching together for a 14th year, and I have to tell you, it's the greatest honor of my life. Thank you, Vice President Mondale.
Here, here. My pleasure. Happy to be here. Sorry it took me so long to get here.